So I'm going to introduce our next speaker to keep us on time. So thank you for those questions. Our next speaker is Pradeep Prabhala, who is partner with McKinsey & Company. Pradeep has advised a number of country governments, bilateral and multilateral donors, development finance banks, and private philanthropic donors on approaches to catalyzing private investment for agricultural development, devising sustainable institutional mechanisms to support investment. He has also been serving the World Economic Forum as an advisor on its flagship New Vision for Agriculture program, which is how we heard about his work and got connected with Pradeep. The title of Pradeep's talk is Incentivizing Food Systems Transformation. Welcome, Pradeep, to the Food Forum.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm just going to pull up the presentation in a second. Great. So before I get started, as Chris was mentioning, I'm a partner at McKinsey & Company, and I lead a lot of our food work. So as such, I think just from a disclosure perspective, we do serve a number of public, private, and social sector players in the food system, both in the US and abroad. So a lot of our work is informed by some of the client work that we do on a day-to-day basis. And as Chris mentioned, I do serve as an advisor to the World Economic Forum's New Vision for Agriculture program. And before I get started, I think a bit of context on what I want to talk about today. I think there's been a lot of conversation about holistic food system transformation. And in fact, I think some of the impetus for the work was driven by how our progress towards sustainable development goals that Chris was mentioning has been so lopsided, right, from a food system perspective. What we've seen was, I think the Sustainable Development Goals were established in 2016, and if you actually review the progress 5 years into the goals, you actually realize that the food systems have predominantly been focusing on increasing production and addressing hunger, right? Maybe to an extent addressing malnutrition. But in general, food systems have been tremendously unsuccessful in protecting the environment, right, and actually delivering integrated health outcomes. So in fact, there was another piece of work that was done by FOLU last year, which had put a size to, I think, the externalities created by food system. Today, food system is about $10 trillion in economic value added, which is roughly the GDP of the system as a whole. And it creates about $12 trillion in external costs, right? So effectively, I think if you think about it, it's a sector that creates more costs than benefits. And when I talk about external costs, these are typically costs from an external environment perspective and from the health perspective. So often I think costs that are being created by food system are being borne by the health system, and in some cases, I think are being borne by the environment. So effectively, when we embarked on this journey, we said that how do we drive more inclusive, sustainable, efficient, and nutritious food systems? And we did say that, listen, I think we don't want to really focus on driving productivity and addressing hunger, which obviously are important parameters. But if you were to sort of rethink about reimagining this food system around those 4 outcomes, how would you design it? So we went through a lot of work, and essentially we've identified 4 pathways that we could use to address these challenges. And we also spent a bunch of time thinking about how do you activate these pathways, at what level do you need to work? I think the specific question that Chris was asking about, which was, does it have to happen at the country level or at the global level? I'll spend a bit of time talking about that. So a few things to level set, right? As I think I've already started talking about what are the challenges in the food system. And as we had discussed, I think the productivity gains in general in the food system is actually the positive side of the story, right? After the 2008 food crisis, we've actually seen significant progress being made on both the amount of food being produced globally, as well as I think the progress towards addressing hunger and malnutrition. Obviously, there's still significant challenges, right? Today, agriculture policies could lead to about 95% of the world's land to be degraded by 2050. Right? We know that 1 in 5 children actually suffer from stunting due to undernutrition, or 2 in 5 adults are are affected by overweight and obesity. And of course, I think the food loss costs about $940 billion annually for the global economy. So there are sort of significant challenges, as you would imagine, from the food system. So therefore, the pursuit of just production doesn't really address a lot of these challenges that are inherently intrinsic to the food systems. So we did said that let's actually figure out how do we sort of transition and make these food systems more effective. And then we started thinking, how do you start addressing this challenge in the food systems, right? If you were to say that, listen, there are a bunch of outcomes that the food system is delivering which are not helpful, then what needs to really change? And if you think about this simplistically, I think you need about globally 500 million farmers to change the way they farm, right? Because often a lot of the environmental footprint today in the food system comes from the farm, right? As well as, I think, the biodiversity losses, right? As well as, I think, any challenges in terms of what's being grown, what is the level of productivity, and so on. So a lot of this starts at the farm. And if you think about it, the magnitude of the challenge, about 500 million farmers today are farming in ways that don't lead to the outcomes that I spoke about. And then on the other hand, you have about 7.7 billion consumers who need to change the way they consume food, right? So effectively, the problem that we have is that in both ends of the food system, you have a fragmentation issue, and you need to be able to actually change behaviors at these two levels, right? And the challenges are manifold, right? I think some of this is financial questions. A lot of the smallholder farmers optimize for incomes or capital accumulation, and effectively a lot of the practices that you might want to implement that lead to better outcomes are not easily borne by them. In some cases, it is just lack of knowledge, right? People just don't know what to do. In some cases, it is attitude towards food. I think, as you would imagine, on consumers' end, most people consume food the way they have been consuming for a long time. Right? And I think there are some broader ecosystem challenges, even if the business case exists for people to change, and assuming that they know what to do and they have the attitudes, you do have a bunch of challenges in the broader ecosystem that makes it really challenging for people to sort of act in ways that you'd want them to act, right? Effectively, I think, therefore, the question really is, how do you really construct the incentives for these players, which is the 500 million smallholder farmers and the 7.7 billion consumers, in ways that would mitigate some of these challenges and lead to better outcomes? And we said that when we think about incentives, the incentives need to therefore do three things, building on the previous page. One is, I think, it needs to fund behavior change costs, right? It needs to mitigate some of the transition and switching costs, and it needs to actually finance ongoing economic costs of the change for people. In addition, we also need to remove perverse incentives that are having an impact on players, where I think, for instance, today there are $100 billion of subsidies that are spent by country governments in the agricultural sector. A lot of those subsidies that either provides price supports or provide input subsidies also lead to some challenges. So you need to figure out a way in which some of those incentives could be removed or restructured to help participants making the right choices. We then went and said, okay, if you were to create these incentives, what's a good way to do that? And we said there are 4 distinct pathways that you could take to solve this challenge. The first one is what we're calling as repurposing public investment in policies. As I just mentioned, about $100 billion every year is spent by country governments on subsidies to agriculture. A lot of them create perverse incentives. So the first question is, how do you change how governments are spending money? And often it's not because they don't want to spend money on the right things. It's often because they are trying to balance multiple outcomes from their food systems. And these outcomes could include, I think, the social outcomes as well as the economic outcomes for the country at large. So therefore, a lot of times, I think these subsidies that governments spend have a rationale, and you need to be able to rethink how to do that. The second area is to sort of think about how can you construct policies that are effective. I know we're going to have a conversation on policies a little later, but I think there are a number of policies that governments can put in place that create the right incentives for players. For instance, if agriculture today produces about 30% of global carbon footprint, just imagine a world in which the governments were to step down and tax the amount of carbon that's being generated by a number of players. The second pathway that we said was important is the business model innovation pathway. I think here's where we think the businesses should change the way they are doing business in a way that actually creates the right incentives for players in the food system. This innovation could come from technology, this could come from product innovation, or this could come from business model innovation. And there are a number of examples, and I know that we're going to have a conversation with Philip talking about some of the things that Danone has been doing in the space, but we do think that businesses need to step up to the plate and innovate around a number of dimensions that creates the right incentives for others in the ecosystem for them to make the change. The third one is what we call as institutional investment pathways. Today, a lot of the capital that is flowing into the different parts of the food system essentially comes with clauses related to financial returns, right? But increasingly, the number of investors that are investing in the food system do care about other outcomes, which fundamentally could incentivize different players in the ecosystem differently. So imagine a world in which BlackRock, one of the largest asset managers, decides to choose to invest a part of their portfolio in food systems by attaching clauses to how that money is going to be spent, right? And a lot of the institutional investors are starting to ask this question as to how do we do this? And not just because of the good of the heart, but in some cases, they are bound by fiduciary duty because today we have enough data on how climate risk could pose risk to their portfolios. And the institutional investors almost have a fiduciary duty to solve this. And the last one is, we said there's a consumer behavior change pathway. This is a tricky one because we said that, listen, consumers are both the part of the problem because I think there's a fragmentation. But we said that this is an important enough pathway that significant demand changes are required for the incentives to be created for others in the ecosystem. Therefore, we've highlighted it as one of the key pathways. Now, if you think about it, each of these pathways are interconnected, right? You can solve a problem with either a policy change or a business model change, and both of them could have exactly the same impacts. At some extent, these pathways, while we're presenting them as independent pathways, are often interconnected, right? So therefore, I think you need to sort of figure out as to how do you sort of make progress along these pathways and what the right levers are for different contexts. And how do you sort of manage trade-offs as you try to implement these pathways. The last thing that I'd acknowledge is that these pathways, I mean, for different countries that have similar challenges but different contexts, might choose to apply very different pathways. So therefore, you need to be able to think about how do you apply these pathways in the context of different countries. That's because one size actually doesn't fit every country. And the last one is, I think countries need to, I think we fundamentally believe that a lot of this change has to happen at the country level. And there's a lot of bespoke models that have to be built at the country level to be able to make this change. But country level actions are not the only things that we care about. There are things, of course, that can be done at the regional and international level. So we'll talk a bit about that as we move forward. So a lot of the work since when we design these pathways, there's the next question, which is, how do you therefore activate these pathways, right? And essentially, if you think about it, today a lot of these pathways are not being implemented by players effectively, right? Because there are and the constraints that are precluding these players that can implement the pathways from implementing them effectively. So we did spend a lot of time thinking about what kinds of challenges do players face as they think about these pathways and propose some solutions. I'm going to go through a few examples. I'm not going to go through this comprehensively, but it might be helpful for you to sort of reflect on some of these. So let's take the repurposing public investment in policies. Often, I think, as I said, I think a lot of governments don't deliberately make choices that are suboptimal for the food system. I think the number of reasons why I think we are in the position that we are in. One is, I think, this compartmentalized approach to working. The health minister doesn't talk to the agriculture minister, who doesn't talk to the commerce minister, where all of them probably have an equal role to play on how the food system functions. there's not a lot of evidence for underlying interventions, right? Governments often are good at scaling programs that they know could deliver certain results. And effectively, if you sort of think about emerging areas such as regenerative agricultural practices, there's not a lot of sound evidence on what are the economics, what returns would it develop. So therefore, in the absence of that evidence, countries find it really difficult to action policy or investment responses. That makes it harder. There's a lot of political will and stakeholder resistance, because obviously food is a highly political question. And in a lot of emerging markets, for instance, I think it's one of the significant determinants of who wins the elections, because food security is such a big issue. And then there is some capacity on making evidence-based decisions. Even if you have the evidence, if you decide to collaborate together, often, especially in emerging markets, there is capacity issues. You'd be surprised, even in a lot of developed countries, I think people find it really hard to make systemic changes together. And the last one is the transition costs, right? As countries think about making some of these changes, who funds the transition costs, right? Like, for instance, let's say if a government decides that I'm going to lower my fertilizer subsidies, which would then lead to farmers actually using fertilizer more appropriately, which reduces the runoff issues and pollution. But the question becomes, if the fertilizer drops, then there's probably a short-term blip that you would see in productivity. And how do governments therefore fund these transition costs that impact the actors is a fairly significant question. So therefore, we did have a bunch of recommendations for how different players could work with governments in enabling that as you move forward. And a good example is, I think, in one case where we've seen governments have repurposed this effectively as the Great Lakes Production Protection Fund, where I think the governors have come together and basically put their investments in awarding projects that could have the impact on the water basin. There is a good example, and I'm happy to talk more about it as we move forward. And the other sort of example that comes to mind is how the Pani Bachao, Pani Kamao, which is Save Water, Earn Money, a program that the government of Punjab in India had established to reduce the water use, electricity and water use in agriculture, is another sort of good example where the governments have stepped up to the plate, and let's actually sort of design interventions that can lead to outcomes that are not just about increased production. Similarly, on the businesses side, I think there's a lot of, I think on the businesses side, I think there are a number of risks. I think there's one is the innovation risk, right? How do you innovate around some of these models while ensuring that you're not putting your shareholder capital at risk? There are often questions around economic models because a lot of these things don't pay for them. Like, for instance, recently we were doing a piece of nutrition work with a consumer player. And I think while they know that they want to innovate around healthy ingredients, often replacing harmful ingredients with healthier ingredients often comes at a cost. And suddenly consumers are not often willing to pay for it. So how do you make the economic model work in a context where you're trying to innovate? Often there are challenges in some cases if companies decide to undertake changes to their business models. They need to do that in the context of the business environment. And that becomes another challenge. The last one is culture change. A lot of companies are not willing to necessarily change because they inherent challenges in the organization to change the way they do business, right? Until you have strong leadership, that makes it really hard. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, but there are ways in which governments could incentivize innovation. Private sector itself could sort of take a prototyping and scaling sort of modes. And I know Philippe, who's from Danone, is going to talk about a bunch of examples on how they've been able to do this effectively. The third pathway, which I'm going to spend a bit of time, is the institutional investment pathway. And I do think that I think this is a critical one because a lot of times institutional investors are not actually discussed in the context of food system. But if you think about it logically, a lot of these investors make significant investments in food system. And the amount of influence that they could have on a company and how it's deploying its capital is actually quite significant, given that they do occupy a significant position on their capital structure. So we do think that there's a lot of work that institutional investors could do in both setting clauses on how their capital could get deployed. But often they struggle with a bunch of challenges as well. I think they don't have the right intermediation mechanisms to deploy their capital into areas that they care about. In some cases, they don't really understand the risk-return profiles of the underlying investments. And sometimes there's no good enabling environment for them to be able to make decisions. And essentially, I think there are ways to sort of create these. In fact, we're currently doing a major piece of work and thinking about how can we channel institutional capital into natural capital. It's a fairly significant piece of work, and we're thinking about how do you sort of channel these by creating new intermediation mechanisms is something that I think I'm happy to talk as a part of the question answer sessions. One good example of, I think, a program that addresses this institutional investment pathway is GAFSP, which is a global agriculture and food security program that World Bank has set up. It actually works and invests alongside institutional investors, so they're taking a tranche of the risk away from the institutional investors, so that the returns for the institutional investors actually work pretty well, and they're able to fund interventions that are delivering more inclusive outcomes. And the last one is sort of consumer behavior change. I know Hildred is going to speak a bunch about this as we move forward, and she is an expert in this. But there is sustainable change required from a consumer perspective in the way they're making their food choices. And I think some of this would require education to consumers. Some of it would require changes to how consumers are being, how businesses are supporting consumers. But that's one of the areas that we need to spend a bit of time on. And I'll not steal Hildred's thunder here, but I think that's another important area. In short, I think my submission overall is that I think these are the 4 pathways that are extremely critical. I think there are ways to sort of think about how to bring these pathways together at the country level. In fact, we are working with the UN system on the upcoming UN Food Summit, which was supposed to happen in 2021, but could get delayed given the current context, in trying to sort of shape a conversation around how do you sort of bring some of these pathways together and align, I think, actors on how can they make progress to a more inclusive and sustainable and efficient and nutritious outcomes for the food system. On that note, I'm going to pause and hand it back to Chris.
Thank you, Pradeep. We have some questions in the question box, as you might imagine. So we may not have time to reach all of them, but I'll give you, we have a few minutes, so I'll start with the first one. The first one is, and there are 2 questions here, but they're related. What is the environmental impact of smallholder farmers in terms of your focus on their behavior change versus the impact that industrial agriculture has? Should we not focus also or exclusively on industrial agriculture and food actors and the negative impacts that those actors have at scale?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Depending on the geography that you'd look at, I think the answer might be slightly different. Agreed, I think in countries like the US, obviously industrialized agricultural companies could have a significant impact because it's a relatively consolidated system, and the influence that these players have on the farmers tends to be significant. So I think that makes sense, but a large part of agriculture today is in fragmented environment globally. So therefore, any solution to address the environmental footprint needs to take into account that reality. So I don't think it's an either or. It's actually it's actually both, right? That'll be important in my mind. Does that answer the question?
I think so. And yeah, there's more questions, so let's continue. We can always go in more depth in the panel discussion later. The next question is about a tax on carbon emissions. It says, we talk about a tax on carbon emissions, but this is an end-of-pipe solution. Why not tax advertising to avoid supply creating demand? This would lead to enough from less rather than more from less.
Yeah. So I do sort of think that, I mean, it boils down to the operationalization of the interventions, right? I think at the end of the day, the reality is that there is, for each of the interventions that you would make, there is a scale implication, there are operational implications and changes that are required, right? So let's take, for example, a highly fragmented environment where there are farmers operating. I think that's one context, and let's take the US, right? And I'll just give you an example to illustrate the point. In the US, you could say that, listen, one way to reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture is by farmers adopting regenerative practices, which would lead to them sequestering more carbon and therefore reducing the net footprint from the system. Now, you may be able to implement this in the US with a select group of farmers, and you might be able to construct a model of routing some money to them through potentially carbon markets, right? And find a way to sort of verify them and get them out and so on. And in those cases, you might say that, listen, I do have a viable pathway where I can construct a mechanism where I would get supplementary income to these farmers for adopting these practices by using things like carbon markets. And the verification in those things become relatively simple because there is some scale in the farming sector. But if you say that, let's take a fragmented environment, it's actually almost impossible to construct a mechanism through which you could channel carbon financing into those farmers. That's because you'd realize that the verification is really hard. There's actually cost of verification that outweighs the benefits from trying to fund those. And then you'd say that, let me figure out other alternative policy levers that would help me do that. And you might sort of use another approach. So I think it depends a bit on what the challenge is, right? I guess John's saying I haven't answered the question.
Well, I mean, I suppose that I heard you saying that it does kind of depend on the environment and whether or not it's a sort of a fertile environment for making a change or not. And that's probably a great topic to pick up more in the panel discussion. So I think we'll pause and maybe return to this question again when everyone has a seat at the table. Thank you so much, Pradeep.